Abdurraqib.
Hello. That was weird. No one said anything. Am I actually naked? Hi. Cool. I'm gonna move this here. So I haven't been to Housing Works in a while, and I really love the work that is done here, and so it's a real honor to be back. And I would love Doreen for joining me. It's a dream come true. Doreen and I were once co-workers, but we're also never really in the same building, but for twice, because I didn't ever go to the building, the MTV News building, because I lived in Connecticut, which is actually hell. I forget sometimes that I can't joke about Connecticut as freely on the East Coast, but nonetheless, here I am. I'm going to read three things. One is a poem about Popeyes Chicken, and I'm going to start with that. And I'm sorry if you've heard me read before and have heard this story before, but last spring, I was in Chicago with some friends, and there was a Popeyes there, and it closed at 1 a.m., which is a real treat to someone like me. And we went in at 12:48. We were going to go to a Spades game afterwards, so we needed some chicken. And we go up there, and they're closing down, man, it's closing down, but there's a lot of chicken in the case. So I was like, I will gladly take that off your hands. Just put it in a box. I'll pay you whatever it is, whatever. And he's like, excellent. You made my job easier. And I was like, you have made my job easier. And as he was boxing up the chicken, we thought they were going to close the shit or whatever. As he's boxing up the chicken, a couple people started lining up behind us. And then more people started lining up behind us. And then there was this outrage when he was like, there's no chicken left. And people were like, what do you mean there's no chicken left? And then someone yelled, I think Eve was there, Eve Ewing, by her book too. But we were leaning against the soda machine and someone yelled, who would take all of the chicken? And Eve was like, yeah, who would do that? And I was like, bring it out back so they don't see. This is a poem about Popeyes and spades and ancestors. It borrows its title and the first line from the Blackstreet song that you know and love. This poem's called No Diggity. Shorty, get down, good Lord, and yes, the Lord is good. Yes, the Lord is as lonely as I feel in the darkness of a strange city, and the Lord points me to the light. I say twice on Sunday and mean I see a savior in anyone. My people say we come from kings, and they mean our fathers have blood on their hands. They mean someone had to die for the money in our pockets, money which tonight is fanned out like the wings of a hunting falcon across the face of a counter at a fried chicken joint where they serve what our mothers taught us how to cook in their kitchens, what our mothers learned from their mothers and their mothers before them. And so we are here in honor of the first Black woman to drop anything in hot oil, in honor of the first Black woman to prepare a feast for a family while her own children held their aching and hollow stomachs. In honor of this, I will be fed by someone else's hands tonight. I will laugh at the bad joke. I will say make love and mean the sound an open palm makes when it slaps a table while holding a card and the fate of an entire night's humor. Everyone I roll with is not above taking into ourselves that which will one day kill us. Something fried to praise in the name of our small and generous lords. I say twice on Sunday and mean I stay 1 foot in the grave with the flyest kicks on. I mean I'm back on my bullshit. I mean I'm back in my feelings again, and I think I'm going to stay this time. Everything I miss is a monument I cannot see through, and yet a small child smiles at me from over their mother's back, and I name the child after all of you. I build them a small future, and listen, if I am being honest, I am weary tonight of giving the bullet more space in the living. Tonight I want a meal I could have made in my own kitchen with my mother's arms over my shoulders. Tonight I want no love that doesn't crumble and stain every part of me it echoes through. Tonight I will watch the stars rust in the arms of no one. Turns out daylight is the new misery, and I am drowning. I am drowning. I am drowning. This poem is new, and it has the word nigga in it a lot, which isn't an apology. It's just information for you to have. I was doing some research I'm working. I almost said was working on. I'm still working on it because I'm sure the edits will be plentiful when they come back. I'm working on a book about a tribe called Quest, which requires a lot of research into '90s rap, which has been like really delightful for me. Like researching is the best part of the writing process. And I found these archives of old Wu-Tang interviews from 1993, like right when they were preparing for their album to come out, the first album. And there's this interview from The Source in '93, and the interviewer, this poem came because I wrote, in short, because I wrote about 3 billboards a lot, and a lot of people were calling me like nigger with an R in my email because I wrote about how much I hated 3 billboards. Fine, happens to the best of us. We live in a racist country, so like, take the good with the bad, I guess. Good shrinking by the day, but we still got it. And so I repurposed, so every time I was called a nigger via email, I pulled that and then repurposed it in the body of the poem. But I was thinking about Raekwon because the interviewer was like, how do y'all get along so well? And Raekwon's response was so great. He says, it's simple. Love your niggas. Love them. And that was it. This poem is called Love Your Niggas. I am considering again how I sit inside of the space between 2 G's, as I did when the officer thumbed the handle of his weapon and asked, what you boys doing out so late one night on Livingston, while the skin of me and my 2 niggas hushed the brightness of the streetlights, and we were old enough boys to know when someone wasn't actually calling us boys. And look at how these fools put dancing shoes on all that language. Like my niggas ain't write the book, and then have the book stolen, and then take back whatever pages they could before slipping out a window. And what you have to realize is that fire knows no master beyond whichever hand summon it. And in Virginia, the torches sprayed a mist of sparks across the sky. And in Ohio, me and my niggas threw our hands over a fire and let the flames seduce the meat brown and crack jokes until somebody's mama got to rolling over in her grave. And some niggas might say to force movement out of the dead is another way to keep the ancestors close. And so I sin and I sin and I sin and I know and I hope when I die there are some niggas still kicking it and willing to yell something heavy and improper about my living so that I too may know what it is to roll over. And to roll up on a nigga is another type of intimacy. And once we rolled up on some niggas over a card game or over some weed or over loneliness. And I guess loneliness is another type of debt. And there's no cure for the ache of living like running with some niggas who might actually get your ass killed. And speaking of absence, I am considering how the space between 2 G's is where we might congregate. Those who love us and those who want to see us dead. Oh, how we've both found ourselves wedded to the way the G sits in the back of the throat for a swift moment before tumbling down the tongue and out of a car window in a hood that's yours or in a town where you might be far away from your niggas. And I am wondering if this is the common ground I have been hearing so much about. It seems I love my G's as you do, executioner. And what a tool this is for the both of us. The way one can wrap their fingers around the letter's open mouth and use its bottom to dig a grave. During the Q&A, the old Black woman who could be my kin in the way who anyone who has outlived my kin could be my kin, asks me what I think about putting the word nigga in my poems. And in another voice, she's asking if I know who had to die for me to be here with this ungrateful tongue, and who am I to curate the small space between love and violence. And I think of this when I say, I love you, my nigga, and slap a hand so hard that the blood vibrates underneath my palm for hours. I want the ghost of every type of love I have for my niggas to echo for days like these, where it is raining in a city, and I make mirrors out of every surface so that I am both me and all my niggas. And I am considering the G again. All my G's done dirt, and some have become it. My G's wish to be made into ash upon their leaving, but we bury my G's anyway. My niggas ain't one to miss a chance to get fly, and a funeral will do if nothing else will. God grant me a good grave in your gracious ground. Let someone else be kept awake at night by the sound of my body moving the earth in the name of all my niggas and all their breathing and iridescent sins. I folded over the page of the thing I wanted to read, but I feel like I'll read a thing that's happy. I was gonna read a thing about Defiance, Ohio, but it's pretty sad. Does anyone know the band Defiance, Ohio, though? if you've heard me read anything out of this book before, you probably know the band Defiance, Ohio now. I'm not going to read that piece. But I'm going to read a thing that requires audience participation. Yes, actually. Some of you have probably heard this before, this whole thing. Everyone, say woo. Oh, wait, not. Well, yeah, sure. But whenever you have a hand. Woo! Great. I had to do that at like a college one time. It was like a very stuffy college, and I had to like keep doing it because people just couldn't like figure out to do it. And I know that like someone was shot on 1 and 3, but I was hoping to unify. This is the great unifier. I'm gonna read this thing. Can everyone hear me? I'm gonna read this thing about Whitney Houston and Michael Jackson. There's this picture I love that I printed off my computer. I love it so much that I printed off my computer in black and white because I didn't want to go to the store and get a color cartridge. It's a picture of Michael Jackson kissing Whitney Houston on the cheek, and what I imagine is like 1988 or 1989. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how black musicians, so many of them exited the 80s differently than they entered it, and how interesting it is to be singular and therefore the only, like the only way that your people can get through hip hop. So I felt a lot about my Jackson music. This is mostly though a piece about black people showing each other affection in public. Yeah. Remember we're doing this thing. Don't blow this. There's a picture of Michael Jackson kissing Whitney Houston on the cheek, and in the picture, Whitney is all teeth, the way she was at the end of the 80s. The way she was in a white dress as wide as heaven's door at the Grammys, where she could not dance in those heels but still sang a song about dancing. And in the picture, Michael is about 6 years removed from having his daddy's nose. And what better way to sever ourselves from the sins of the father than to rebuild the temple? And the kiss in the picture is gentle, the way it might be for an old friend or a lover or two kin meeting for a moment as the damned American engine of pop music began at their backs, with howling for them to shake their skins to the ground and sing the hits. In the picture, Whitney and Michael are under a tree and on a bridge somewhere south. And it is easy to imagine a song will lead. It is easy to imagine a song in the water beneath them which once perhaps ran through a preacher's hands or over a baby's head. And history repeating itself would not be so bad if not for the chorus of violences accumulating along the landscape where small miracles sometimes took place. And in the picture, both of their eyes are closed. And I wish for a home in that darkness, a small and black eternity. Woo! It is likely true that we only get one livable youth, and I wasted mine thinking myself beautiful, and throwing rent money into juice, and scrolling my phone number on Skin in summer, and watching it sweat off outside of Goodale Park where we just had to dance to a song we all knew, and performing self-worship as survival, and giving myself unkillable over to a parade of death instruments, and racking up just enough sins to make praying worth the time, and leaving socks tangled in bed sheets, and sneaking out of the room before sunlight ruptured in silence, and locking arms with a motley crew of hooligans in the drunken hours, and shoving 5 bodies into the back seats of cabs, and opening the doors and sprinting down Livingston when it came time to pay the driver, while he cursed the names of our families, a small penance for keeping the cash we'd spend on the pills we'd never be bold enough to take, and in the mirror, I would try to smile as wide as my mother, who in the early 90s would sing pop music while steam hung over her afro in the kitchen, and who would crane her neck backwards to laugh, like the jokes were spilling from God's own pockets. And I am telling you all of this to let you know that I too want to feel the heat with somebody. Or at worst, I want to be a child of the heat's eager production, the smoke that rises and dances thick in the air, the ghost over those who labor in our names and then become the ghost themselves. And it's a shame our wings don't arrive until after we've already raced off the cliff and never ever looked below. And it's a shame to still have all of these living hands and barely anything left worthy of touch. The joke hiding in Thriller is that if you play anything for long enough, it can be like the dead never left. Revive, swaying in leather down another boulevard, I tell my boys that Michael was most black when he died without being able to save his land. No one gets that joke either. It seems that the nightmares about drowning have once again mounted my dreaming hours and have left me gasping into the stillness before morning, and yet I still have not learned to swim. In the bath, I sit with the water just below my chin, a height that would not cushion my hunger for sleep, but the world is undoing itself, and I must tend to my vast and growing field of fears. In this new country, a Nightmare is nothing but a brief rental home for the mind to ransack. You need the sleeping body unharmed. Around the porch after the cookout, the big homie says, listen, in the 80s, police were locking people up for putting anything to their lips and lighting a match. So it wasn't really shit to be smiling about. Then he closes the photo album and the picture of him as a boy in a single white glove. Science says that two dead stars collided once, and that's how Earth got all of its gold. It is not vanity to cover yourself in what your people created underneath the summer's worth of southern branches. And it is not vanity to grow weary of telling the world you cannot be fucked with. And it is not vanity to coat your casket in excess and have the people who loved you there related your excess for one last time. And I imagine it as a question of comfort. Heaven as the only chart worth topping. And it turns out that I want all pictures of me loving my people to be in color. I want the sunlight glistening its way across our faces to be always amber, and never an absentee that might mistake our lineage for something safe. And I'm speaking of artifacts again, not of how I cut my hand to the chins of those I love and kiss them on their faces. And this type of love will surely be the death of us all. This type of love will surely shake the angels loose and send them running to their horns. Hi, Doreen.
Hi, Hanif. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
So Hanif and I did work together as writers for Viacom for a little bit over a year.
We survived over a year.
We did. We are survivors.
Yeah.
And we weren't in spaces, like you said, physically together often.
Yeah,
But we did have a pitch meeting every week,
we did.
which was conducted over Skype. And Hanif would talk to us from Connecticut, sometimes from Columbus.
Yeah.
And I always got to see the genesis of his ideas, right? So it would just be, you'd see the little screen, it was just Hanif's face, and he'd be like, I'm thinking about this. And I remember in one pitch meeting, you were thinking about Nina Simone. And then the Nina Simone essay was produced, and I remember feeling like this person listens to music in a way that I actually can't even really understand, because there's something about your acceptance of music into your body, your acceptance of music into how you create language, that I think it's right in that special limbo between prose and poetry, between sound and silence, between love and violence, that I find absolutely just mesmerizing. So I'm very happy.
That's one of the nicest things anyone's ever said about anything I've written.
But I believe it, and I'm very happy to be talking to you about music and writing and poetry tonight.
Thanks, Doreen.
Of course. So my first question is, why did you place the exclamations where you did in your reading?
Wait, where? In the...
Just now. The audience exclamations.
Oh, I guess I didn't explain that. I'm sorry. I'm so used to, that's weird. I read that piece like all the time, and that piece is in several sections, and that's how I differentiate the switching of the sections. And I used to do this thing where I would snap to differentiate the sections, but my friend, the brilliant poet Franny Choi, was like, what's wrong with you? Don't fucking snap at an audience. It felt very like aggressive and street harassy to just be like, come on. So I was like, oh no, what can I do? And then the poet Sam Sachs, that's a move that I stole from him. He has like this poem in several sections that he breaks up by doing that. And I thought it was like a fun thing. Also, that's a piece in the book that's very happy, I think, or at least it makes me feel good. And when I read it, gets very sad and dark, and I'm sorry. But when I read it, like every time I read it, I feel it exiting my body, and I am therefore less happy than I was when I started reading it. And there's something about having the audience kind of revel in that joy as well with me. It's a very selfish thing. My hope is that you all feel less happy when I'm done reading it too. And so thank you for committing yourself to that. But I think it's a piece that I feel a lot of joy about, and I want to bring the joy into the room. But yeah, it's because it's in a bunch of different sections that are not, I should have explained that. I'm sorry. Y'all just did it. Cool. Yeah, the sections all by themselves are not tied to anything. they're tied to like one theme of like loving your people in public, but very vaguely. And so like those sections are chopped up by people being hype about being here. Thanks y'all.
What's the first piece of music that you remember listening to?
There's two answers to that. Well, tell me yours. I want to hear yours. Sorry.
Oh, wow. I thought I was interviewing you, but I guess I'm being interviewed.
I'm sorry.
Too. No, that's a great question. I think the first. That's why I asked it. Probably. Oh, it was definitely Celine Dion.
Bangers.
It was Celine Dion.
Celine Dion has so many perfect songs.
She really does. It was probably. I wonder if it was a Titanic theme. My family is Haitian,
right?
And so they love Celine because a lot of her music is, francophone.
Yeah.
But she also sings a lot in English too. And I remember my mom just blasting that song in our house, crying all the time. So probably, yeah, Celine.
So mine is two-tiered. I only thought about this because the other day I was on a podcast that talks about Muslim identity. And technically the first song I heard was the Call to Prayer. Well, one, I mean, yes, from like a very beautiful, like ritualistic level, because is anyone here Muslim? When you're born, shout out to the Muslims in the room. I was like, I can only see like this row. I was like, oh, everyone's Muslim. Salams to all of you. So when you're born, I think this only happens with boys. I don't remember which Islamic traditions are richly divided down gender lines, but I'm going to roll the dice and say 99% of them. But your father sings the Call to Prayer in your right ear. And so like that was the first song I heard, but also in the house, I heard my father singing the Call to Prayer when I was young, and that felt very like musical to me, because I joke that even if you can't sing, like if you can sound good singing the Call to Prayer in Arabic, because the language is such that it's like language auto-tune, like motherfuckers just like sound good. But also Whitney Houston was the first pop star I noticed as a pop star, because my mother would sing along to her in the house. And so I thought she was she was obviously in the 80s, but like in my mind, she was the most famous person ever to live, because my mother, who, didn't sing along to much, was singing along to like, I Want to Dance with Somebody, and I was like, this is the best song in the world. Technically kind of is still. But in the moment, I was like, this is the only song I want to hear for the rest of my life.
Yeah. So in this collection of essays, many of which, they've been published in previous outlets, you are not afraid to kind of thumb into every musical scene. So right now we've been talking about pop music, but you also talk about emo, you talk about rap, you talk about punk scenes. But I found myself especially gravitating to your essays about you being like a scene kid.
Yeah.
In Columbus. And there were you're such an interesting writer, because you're always in crowds, but you're kind of like alone in those crowds, and you feel, oh, Hanif is an observer. He's an anthropologist. He can't help it. He's always watching what's happening around him. And in one essay you describe seeing this young Black kid being, he falls down in the pit, and you want to make eye contact with him, and you're not able to, and you're also like not even sure why it is you want to make that eye contact with him.
Right.
And I thought, it was like, oh, is this a sublimation of your experiences being in that scene? So yeah, I would just love to hear you talk more about how you racialize the idea of like being a scene kid in Columbus.
Yeah, I think I do want to say that I think that most of the scenes I grew up on have gotten better about racial politics, though are still just like fucking awful on gender politics. And like queer politics too. Well, yeah, I don't know, depending on where you're at in the country. But in Columbus, there wasn't, the punk scene didn't have a lot of like people of color on it at the time. Mm-hmm. It was like me and my pal Tyler, who was half Black and could pass as white. And so he was a good like ally for me in that space, because he was like very large, and passed as white, and so like if anyone fucked with me, they would have to also fuck with him, and no one wanted to fuck with him. And so I think all the time about what it is to be, and maybe I mentioned this in the essay, what it is to be not at all visible until your use is being a target, right? You're only useful if you're the target of some violence. And I think that was in some ways thrilling for me as a young kid, or like as a teenager, and also terrifying, but thrilling in some ways because I think that punk scenes normalize violence in a way that's not good, right? But if you are in that space, it is easy to think, if I am a target, at least I am of use, right? I'm not encouraging that, by the way. This is like reflective, not like rah-rah. But you feel of use even when you are the target of violence. And so that makes you feel like you're part of a scene, because so much of the scene talk is all about like familial bonds. And every family has the person who is the weaker or the target of, and so it was easy to convince myself of that. And I've never been extremely violent, like physically violent. I'm sure I've put many people through layers of emotional violence through my terrible, terrible 20s. But I've never been very physically violent. And so I was often not drawn to that unless I had to be. And I think there's also something interesting about having violence seeming like violence is being forced out of you in a space where you don't want to have it forced out of you. It feels like you can become a different person. And so the music is perfunctory, right? It's easy for me to like now romanticize the music, but I think in the moment the music was secondary. It was a way to be a person different than the person I was in my house or at my school or wherever else.
Violence is an interesting thread through these essays. It comes up when we're talking about punk scenes, but it also comes up when we're talking about hip hop. And we're talking about rap, and of course misogyny does too. Yeah. And I thought it was really fascinating in your essay about Migos, the way you talk about how rappers sort of have to perform a sensation or a image of violence in order to be seen as authentic.
Yeah.
And we don't really like the idea of rappers like being storytellers, creating their own mythologies in the way that it makes a lot of sense for a band like My Chemical Romance to do that with the Black Parade. And so I would love to hear you talk more about did you have that reaction, that desire for your rappers to be like authentically who they said they were in music and in films?
No, I'm actually amazed when people, I think we're getting out of this now. I think we're at a phase in rap where people are like, I don't need my rappers to be what they say they are. But I came up in an era where like there was this idea of like real rap. I'm amazed when people are like, I want my rappers to be what they project to be. None of the rappers you love are what they project to be. Or have loved, right? Like, this is maybe sacrilege to folks, like Tupac wasn't Tupac, you know? Like, he was a whole ass person. The problem was that, I mean, the like grand problem of Tupac is when he started believing he was Tupac, right? The grand problem of rap is when you start believing your mythology. And I think we don't give rappers enough space to step out of their mythology and be whole people the way that we did with like Johnny Cash. And sometimes the mythology, I mean, My Chemical Romance is an interesting point because the Black Parade mythology like consumed them, right? That was the problem, was that it consumed them so much that they had a hard time going on. And I want my rappers to be able to build, the rappers I love most are the rappers who lie to me in a way that doesn't make me want to question it. Like Pusha T has probably lied to me 100 times, but I still believe everything he says. You know, there was that interview, Pusha T, they did an interview on like the 10th anniversary of Hell Hath No Fury, the Clips album. And Malice was like, you know, Malice believes in God now. Good for him, by the way. And he's like giving all this like flowery language about the depths of what the album meant to him. And the interviewer looks at Pusha T and he says something like, well, the claims on that album are just so outrageous. How could you? Or something like that. And Pusha T with a straight face, not missing a beat, said, I believe every single word I said on that album. And I thought, yeah, I do too. You know what I mean? Like, why wouldn't I? Because you believe, like, Rick Ross is one of the greatest fiction writers of our era. I know that sounds funny, but I'm serious. Because Rick Ross has asked us time and time again to suspend our disbelief, like hard facts, right? Like hard facts that man is like not what he said, you know what I mean? Like, but it works. I know that Rick Ross is a liar, and I'm still so invested in his storytelling. He's a great storyteller. And I think sometimes if you're a good enough storyteller, I mean, I don't know, we all, like, folks in here, especially from like Black families, all have the person in your family who's the like tall tale weaver. And you invest in that. You become so tied to that. And I desire that in my music. And so, like, I'm not saying Rick Ross makes great songs all the time. I'm not like #1 Rick Ross stan, but I'm not even into Rick Ross for the songs at this point. I'm just into him for the narratives that are completely not true, that we know are not true, but he puts them together in a way that makes sense. And I think that's brilliant.
Yeah. So before, when you were mentioning research, which is something that you do so slyly in your essays, like when you read an essay by Hanif, you might not catch the depth of work that he's done to be able to give you something that feels so easy, something that feels so fluid. Like, I know, like, you were just like going through all of these archives, going through records, and going through especially interviews, which I find very fascinating because the 90s was the heyday of Black media in that way. And so you'll read the source, you'll read Vibe, and you'll encounter interviews that white media just can't get anymore. And so earlier you were referencing Raekwon talking about, like, I just love my niggas and that's it. But that appears in an essay about Schoolboy Q, actually. And he did an interview where and maybe he was performing, we don't know, but he said, you know, like, when white people come to my concert, like, they should say the word nigga because they're there and they're my fans. And what I love about that essay is that you're not condemning him. At one point, you say that you actually feel a little bit envious that he could be so rosy-eyed about the whole situation.
Yeah, which doesn't mean I want. Listen.
Don't do that.
Like, y'all do what you want, but it's a different era. I'm not necessarily Schoolboy Q. I'm not gonna like jump off a stage and fight you, but there's a lot of Blacks in here, so it's not everyone's as docile as I am.
Yeah, but the point is that Black people are not a monolith,
right? Yeah,
right? Yeah. And that is one discussion where you really you'll hear like 100 different opinions on what people think.
Yeah.
And I wanted to. How do you get to the point where you're like, I'm not going to condemn somebody like Schoolboy Q, and I'm more just going to sit with my discomfort with what he thinks?
Well, Schoolboy Q is an interesting point because of his logic with that, right? He imagines it as a financial exchange. Like, his whole thing, like, his full logic was like, if you are paying to come to see me, you are funding my career and my life and my family's life, I will allow you for this night to, like, let loose. And which is weird. I think it's so weird that people are like, listen, you're white, you want to let loose, just come out and say nigga. It's like, y'all got like jet skis and shit. Just go like, I don't know, to a winery. But that's his logic, right? Is that like, you are feeding my family. So, and I had a hard time with that. I wrote that essay because I was struggling with that, because I was very angry when I first saw that interview. And like, how could you? But then I realized that for him, it means nothing, right? And I think that the word doesn't sit inside his body in the way it sits inside of mine, and that's important to acknowledge. And I think that having one, and you know this, obviously, like, having Black friends is vital, right? But not having the same kind of Black friends. For a long time, like, I was just like, my Black friends are just straight Black dudes, right? And not for a long time, but for too long. And I think changing the perspectives that I got, because Black culture is like, has many branches, and then those branches have branches, right? And to not have access to that is a failure of the ways in which we see ourselves, and then by reflection, the ways in which we see the world. And not only that, it harms the ways that the world views us, because a Black person who's had just one singular Black experience writing on the authority for Blackness, that shit gets taken seriously by people who are not Black, right? And that is dangerous, because if you are speaking as though you're an authority, and you only have this one experience, and you are not dipping in other wells, that's that shit that'll have people out here like, well, it's cool to be this way towards Black people because this person said it, you know what I mean? Or like they're showing anti-Blackness against their own people, so like why can't I? And it hurt for me to like come to terms with this Schoolboy Q thing and realize that for him, he viewed it as strictly financial. And do I agree with it? No, like not really. But I do envy this idea that in order to strip the pain away from the word, you can consume it easier. I don't know how he arrived at that. Perhaps it is money. Perhaps there's enough money to make it not painful. I know that if I were at a Schoolboy Q show and a bunch of white people were saying nigga, I would feel very tense. And I don't know how to, I think a lot about the ways, because I came up in performance poetry, right? I always think about the way words sit inside of me, like physically sit inside of me. And so that I think about how they sound coming out of me, because I think that's an important part of the writing and editing process. And I, in part, wrote the poem I read about nigga because last fall, or in fall of 2016 maybe, I was doing a reading at like this really white institution in the South, so it's just more layers, with, among other people, my dear friend and brilliant genius, Dinesh Smith, and I was sitting next to them, and I was like, I'm gonna read this poem, but I don't wanna read it because it has the word nigga in it, and I don't know if we can say bad words. And Dinesh was like, that's not a bad word. It's the best word. And I thought, yeah, that's really freeing. To then say like, this is the best word, and I get to say it's mine. And so I'm wondering then if my apprehension towards Schoolboy Q is less about offense and more about pride, right? I have the best word at my disposal, and it sounds great coming out of my mouth because it is mine and it was passed down from people who wanted to do harm with it, and now I've manipulated and it's mine, and you can't have it, you know? And Schoolboy Q was saying, actually, you can have it. It's cool. It's like, I started in that essay, I was reckoning with this idea of like, am I angry about the history of the word, or am I being too prideful in what I believe I own? And there's some, I mean, I think there's probably both of those are true.
Yeah.
Sorry if that was a long and bad answer.
No, it was really revelatory. Thank you for it. What do you think about this declaration that people are saying that rappers and artists in hip hop are the new rock stars?
I don't, can I bounce that back to you? What do you think of it?
What do I think about it? Well, it's interesting because I think the gesture that's being made there is the acknowledgement that rock is maybe more of an aesthetic category now than it is purely musical. So it's about posture, it's about mythologies, it's about personas. I think that's what people are saying.
Right.
But it's also an acknowledgement of the market, which is to say, you know, there were these like big stories that came out last year. There were like, hip hop sells, people buy Black music. Yeah. Maybe hip hop is now the lingua franca of pop in general. Like maybe it's overtaken these genres that in some ways it was born from. And so I'm interested in that. And I think it's like very provocative to say, you know, there is a lineage between someone like Thug and Bowie. Like I like that. I think it's really sexy, but I also wonder, is this is it a sort of flattening that we have to do to be able to consider these people as worthy of deep thinking?
I think that's my thing, right? Is that, and I think it's also, this is like maybe too high level conspiracy feeling. But,
I love conspiracy.
Well, and I think it's a flattening in a way to separate. I think saying rap is the new rock, in some ways, there's an undertone, or perhaps two layers undertone, that is trying to separate people's thinking from the fact that Black people also invented rock music, right? It makes this conversation like, well, rappers can have rock now. And it's like, well, you know, like, why not? I'm more interested in a conversation that asks, is Little Richard the first rapper, right? Is Little Richard more hip hop than Migos? Because he is the, you know, the flamboyant god from which all the children sprang, right? And so I'm more interested in that, perhaps, in this idea of, because I still remember, there are rock purists who will never accept that. Ray Shremmerd, you know, like, Sway Lee like fake played a guitar in the Black Beatles music video and like rock purists freaked out. You know, they're just like, oh, he's not really, you can tell he's not playing because his fingers aren't on the chords. It's like, you fucking nerd, like, it's like a music video. He's not strumming in rhythm with the sounds. And it's like, I don't know, man. Like, and so that's a problem too, right? Is that people don't believe this world in which rappers, they think, I think a lot of people think in saying that they're dumbing down rock music because they don't believe that rappers have the sonic aesthetics to be rock musicians, whatever that even means now. When, you know, I think they're like, I think Young Thug has adequate understanding of melody. I think Future's entire career is rooted off the fact that he understands melody because he's not like a lyricist. He understands hooks and melodies. I don't think that's like, and I like Future a lot. That's not like a knock on Future. It's, you know, praise of his immense ability to like find his way through a hook and find, I mean, something like, sorry if anyone in here was under the illusion that Future is like one of the best lyricists alive. But you look at a song like Stick Talk or like Mask Off, it's like it's a hook. Can anyone remember most of the lyrics of those songs in the interior body of the song? The hook is what gets you. And so I think these people are songwriters, but I don't need them to be rock stars. I've got my rock stars already.
So your mode as a critic is you're the skeptical romantic or the romantic skeptic.
Yeah, probably.
I'm sainting you this now.
I can get a sweatshirt made tomorrow.
Which is to say, when you read Hanif, you're very honest about things in the music that you're listening to that you love, and honest about things in the music that you think are questionable or things that need to be questioned. And that all stems from the fact that you're so intimate with your subject. I think a lot of critics like to practice distance, like to practice dispassion, but you like to you so often are literally in the middle of the fray, literally in the middle of the crowd. Does that do you feel pressure about how artists might, like if they were to read your essays and your criticism, do you feel a pressure and anxiety about how they might interpret your intimacy with their work?
Well, no, but it's also easy for me to say because I'm writing it, right? Not reading it from the. I imagine there are probably some art. Like I imagine if like. So the central piece of my book is like a 8,000 word essay about Fall Out Boy, and I would imagine if one of them read it, they might think it was weird. But it's not really about them. I think that's the thing too, is that like I so often look at bands or songs and albums and say, thank you for this entry point into another thing that I am feeling. And so that 8,000 words is not really about Fall Out Boy. It's about my friend dying and me not knowing what to do with myself after it. And, you know, that essay on the Black Parade isn't really about the Black Parade as much as it's about figuring out how to be okay with the fact that I'm gonna die and we're all gonna die. Sorry, bummer, spoiler alert. Not tonight, hopefully. So, you know, do what you gotta do, get some phone numbers if you'd like to. But I also think that my hope is that musicians would read them and see what I'm trying to do. I often think, and this is kind of from the ethos of Jessica Hopper, who was our boss at MTV, and someone who's been my mentor for a lot of years, right? The idea that the work of the critic is to get comfortable with being wrong. Instead of telling everyone that they're right, you know, the critic often, I think now or sometimes, or even the critics I grew up reading, they bought their work to me and I was supposed to understand that they were correct, right? And I was supposed to love what they were telling me to love because they were correct. I'm so much more interested in being comfortable with being wrong and writing through a piece without any intention of being right at the end of it, but looking for ways to better articulate my wrongness so that I might understand whatever is on the other end of it. And that is oftentimes why I take on challenges and write about or immerse myself in albums that I don't think I would like right away. Especially pop albums. It's like what's her name? Camila Cabello's album was the first perfect example because I was like, I don't want to hear this shit. But I was drawn to it in part because I like Young Thug's part in Havana. And I sat with it for like a long road trip And in figuring out what I didn't like about it, I ended up kind of liking it, right? And I know that's just like some rigorous stuff that not everyone has time for. And I appreciate that. But I love music. I love music so much. Music has the first intimate relationships I had, not like in a real intimate, not like sexual. I in my head, I was like, this is gonna sound beautiful. And I was like, no, it's gonna sound like I'm like fucking CDs. But like, I think my best intimate moments are the ways I learned intimacy were through music. And that's not to say, I mean, Black masculinity is like wild complicated as is all masculinity. And my mother died when I was young, and so I did not have a blueprint for vulnerability the way that I'd like to have had it. And so music was a way for me to find vulnerability and intimacy. And so I love music so much, and I love what music has given me a language for in the way that it's allowed me to move through the world. And so I owe it fairness, and I owe it openness, and I owe it the ability to sit with me for longer than just a listen, you know? I listened to the whole last Migos album, and it felt like I aged 10 years, but I did it because I love music, and I felt like that album was like longer than some films. Halfway through, I was like, I feel like I'm reading Infinite Jest. You know what I mean? Like, it's like how I felt when I was reading Infinite Jest, and I was like, great, I'm almost done. And it's like, nope, 900 more pages, 900 more Quavo hooks. But, yeah, I don't know. That's a long answer, but.
Speaking of intimacy, I think the relationship that really stands out as these essays all together, they make themselves like their own mechanism, and they also are separate elements, separate parts. But the relationship that you keep coming back to is your relationship with Tyler. Yes. And Tyler kind of bursts in your life as a protector of sorts.
Yeah.
And, you know, when did you know that you were okay to write about him and okay to write about your relationship?
It's a good question. There's a very bad, well, it's not bad. It's kind of bad. There's a kind of bad poem in my first book, In the Crown Ain't Worth Much, about Tyler and Pete Wentz, and it you know, it's like in the book because I felt like I had to put it there. But I remember after that thinking, gosh, I'm not ready to approach writing it. And I wrote that poem in 2014. And I remember reading it and thinking, well, I'm not ready to do this yet, you know? And I thought, I'm trying to think of how to word this best. This makes sense in my head, and I apologize if it doesn't, right? I sometimes think about grief as a series of moving puzzle pieces. I think about any kind of trauma or sadness as a series of moving puzzle pieces. And I know that I am ready to articulate how I feel about it when the puzzle piece fits where it's supposed to go inside of me, without me forcing it, without me kind of hammering away at it. I knew I was ready to write about Tyler when I stopped thinking of our living moments as fleeting and begun instead to think about him as if he was always in the room with me. Maybe that's a little like woo-woo or whatever, but I mean, I also experienced death a lot at a young age, you know, and so I think that process has always been tough for me, but I was really interested in writing a piece that was trying to unravel my relationship with this band, the band being Fall Out Boy, and why I stayed. And it was because they had an album come out that I hated, and I listened to it many times and hated it, but I kept listening to it, and I was wondering why I was putting myself through that. And I realized that it's because it is a place in which someone I lost would be living, right? Inside of that record is this like shitty record from a band I loved when I was a kid. There's a chance that someone I lost might be loving it. And so I felt obligated to love it as well. And I think that's really powerful. But in my mind, I never know when it's okay to write about pain until it begins to hum almost unnoticeably. That's really dark, perhaps, but
it's not, because there's a hum in the book, but you're not unfamiliar with the rituals of death and of grief and of mourning. you are very close to them, and that's something that I actually associate with a certain lineage in Black writing and Black cultural production.
Yeah.
There were some parts in your book, you know, when you talk about encountering Michael Brown's gravestone, you know, and that's an essay about Bruce Springsteen. I think it almost made me think about like some parts in Beloved almost,
That's right.
where it's like this Morrisonian thing of not being, obviously being in awe of death, but not being necessarily like just fearful of it. There's a lot of different like sensations that I think that you are willing to honor in a way that some people would maybe feel like, oh, you know, like our only reaction to death is just supposed to be like, that is bad and I don't want that. But you talk about it in a way that's like, it's much more nuanced.
Yeah, I started to think recently that I am not even that fascinated by death, but I am fascinated by the idea of absence, right? So I'm fascinated by the space that death leaves and not exactly the death itself. I know those are similar, but I don't really ruminate on the afterlife anymore. I don't really ruminate on like, or feel like I have to expand on what a death meant to me. My mother's typewriter still sits in a closet in my old house where I grew up, right? I am fascinated by the fact that there's a stack of papers that was a book in progress that she was writing when she died, and it'll never be finished because she's not here to finish it anymore. And so I'm already outside of her death by like 3 or 4 steps, right? I'm not even thinking about the death. I'm thinking about the fact that what it is to die without completing something you believe in. That is what I'm more fascinated by than, yeah, burial is what it is. And I don't want to be flippant about death. I really don't. But I think that I am more shaped by ghosts than I am by my memories of death itself. And I'm wondering what that means. I mean, it's probably because I've lost a lot of people. But I've lost a lot of people, and I've therefore gained a language with which to celebrate them as if I haven't lost them at all. And that's like I don't know. I don't think about grief as only grief. I think whenever people read my stuff and they're always like, well, this is just so sad. And I'm, yeah, sure, yeah, fine, that's cool. But I think that sadness is not a singular emotion, right? Like, in my mind, emotions exist on trees, and they all have roots that come out in every angle. And sadness is one single feeling that leads to a wellspring of, hopefully, of other feelings, right? Sometimes they're not all good, but ideally, much like learning learning the stuff you don't fuck with, like rocking with the stuff you don't fuck with is a way to talk about it. I don't like feeling shame around sadness, because being sad has given me a language to articulate joy that I wouldn't trade for anything.
I have a craft question.
Oh no.
It's simple.
Okay.
Prose and poetry. There's some, I don't even know what to call them because they're not quite, there's pieces in the book that kind of act as interludes.
Yeah.
And there's the Marvin Gaye thread, of course, which is, we experience it in different episodes throughout the reading of the essay. And when I read your book, I'm like, is he like, when you're writing, do you speak out loud? Like, what's your process? Because there's an internal rhythm within your prose that obviously makes us think about poetry, your use of ampersands, the way that you fit sentences together, actually like puzzle pieces. And so if you could like put us in the room where it all happens, how do you write?
Yeah, it's probably very uncomfortable to watch. I write alone in my house usually. Well, not lately because I've been on tour, so I've had to write in like planes or hotel rooms. But I pace and I talk out loud. Those are my 2 big writing tics, I guess you can call them. Some of that has to do with my performance background. Right? I came into poetry by saying my poems out loud to audiences, and so I need to know if anyone here writes poems, I would say that editing is not what happens on the page always. Editing is what the work sounds like when it comes out of your body, because that's when it'll tell you like, nope, or absolutely, right? one of my mentors is the poet Jamal May, and a long time ago, maybe in 2013, Jamal said this thing to me that was very simple but made the most sense in the world. And he said, if you're gonna read your shit out loud, you might as well be good at it. And I was like, absolutely. And so I thought, if I'm gonna write my shit down, I should know how it sounds too. I don't necessarily edit. This is gonna sound really weird. I said that I like explained this in a workshop recently, and everyone was looking at me like I was out of my mind. So like, bear with me. But so much of my writing process is editing, but I don't think about editing. Like when I edit, I don't necessarily read the work, I hear it. You edit your work like a band leader, right? You think of someone like John Coltrane, who was good, but was mostly good because he knew how to sacrifice himself for the greater good of the band. Great saxophone player, better editor. Rihanna is someone who, is something that, am I rambling now? I'm sorry about something completely disparate. I remember, I almost said I'm old enough to remember. Oh no. Oh God. Like All the Lights is like super celebrated now because it's like a masterpiece of a song. But I remember when it first came out, and a lot of people were like, "Oh, Rihanna doesn't make sense on that song." But like Rihanna makes a perfect sense on that song. No one else makes sense on that song. You know why? Because when the song swells, when the horns and the drums and all that shit is swelling at the beginning, Rihanna's voice fits exactly in the middle of that sound wave, so that it becomes one with the instruments itself. And that shit is on purpose. And it's because Rihanna knows how to sacrifice for the greater good of a sound. That's why she's like good on rap hooks, and also because she can do a lot with her voice, so she knows what not to do. And so I think of the editing process like that. And that's why I read my stuff out loud, because every writer has their thing that they know they're good at. Every writer does. You can be shy about it. It doesn't matter. You know what it is. You're better off admitting it to yourself. The thing that's hard is, are you okay with the rest of the world not seeing that thing in lights? That's what editing is, in my mind. And so to me, there's no difference between prose and poetry because I'm approaching it with the same blade. I'm saying, I know what I'm good at. I have my two things that I know I can do really well that make people go, oh, that's great. But how do I do that and not show it off for the greater good of this longer piece? Maybe that's the difference in editing poetry and prose, is that in prose, I'm often saying, cool, I'm not gonna say what my tricks are because I don't want anyone to. But in prose, I'm often saying, how can I not do this for the greater good of the other 1,500 words? Where in poetry, it's like, well, I got this small space, so I need to do this. So my writing process is a lot about weighing sacrifices and trying to come out the other side of that while still feeling good about myself and feeling confident in myself as a writer, even though I believe that I'm sacrificing the great saxophone solo for the better good of the entire song.
So I have one last question.
Yeah.
What is the wildest thing that you've ever seen in a concert? And like really wild. Think about it, take a few seconds.
What's the wildest thing you've ever seen at a concert?
So
this is great.
Loved St.
Loved them.
As a girl. So obviously.
Like you're like, not anymore.
Well, we know that certain things have not aged well.
Right, it's true.
Meaning Justin Timberlake. But I obviously like went to see them a lot whenever they were touring, and they would pass through my small hometown of New York City. And that was the first time that I've seen it since, but it was the first time that I saw someone actually kind of like the secular equivalent of catching the spirit in a concert. And it was this person who might have been 12 or 13 years old, raging with hormones, who like, I just saw her get more and more flushed and fevered during the performance of, I think it was It's Gonna Be Me. And her eyes just started like flickering. She like, totally fell on the ground. And I remember being so enticed by that and also being like really scared. I was like, oh my God, did they did she die? But that was one of the first times that I'd realized something that I experienced a lot in the church as a girl, that feeling actually was interior to many spaces, and that people could become so overwhelmed by music from NSYNC that it could cause them to have that reaction. And so that really like stays in my mind. I've obviously been like in a lot of performance halls and concert and like, huge venues, but that sort of like seeing someone in a crowd of thousands of people experience this like possession was foundational.
That was better than any answer I have. I'll do, damn.
I'm sorry.
I've seen no one catch the Holy Spirit. I will say that, so 3 things that are mostly funny, kind of. So I remember when Paramore first came out, there were all these hilarious rumors about them, because you would like, if you were at Warped Tour the year Paramore like broke, like the year Pressure came out, the first single, you would hear this stuff like, yeah, there's this like new band and they're fronted by like this 11-year-old girl. I mean, that was the thing, because Hayley Williams is like tiny and like was very, I think when Paramore came out, she was what, 15? And so it was just like, yeah, she's got like this really big voice, but she's like 10. So you gotta see them. And so the first Paramore show Warped Tour, they played like early as shit because they were nobodies, but it was crowded as fuck because everyone was like, we gotta see this kid. And they come out, and for a moment you could be like, yeah, maybe Hayley Williams is 10. And the 2 guitarists were really into theatrics. And once one guitarist like got on his knees and the other one tried to jump off his back and into the crowd, and he slipped because Paramore was like super young, so they're like, we're gonna put on a great show. And he slipped and fell sideways into the drum set, and the drums like tumbled off the stage. And so that was my first time seeing Paramore. And I mean, they've come such a long way. Like, I know that like people say that shit, but like I heard their last album and I was like, I remember when these motherfuckers like were falling into each other's instruments. 2 things I write about in the book, or maybe one I wrote about and one I didn't. There was this, it is really something to see a band not only in the city they come from, but right before they get very big. An example of this, I saw the Gaslight Anthem play in Jersey the night before the 59 Sound came out. It was one of the best concerts I've ever seen, because they had a fundamental understanding of the fact that when they woke up in the morning, their careers would not be the same as they were that night. So I saw Fall Out Boy play this Halloween show. It's on the internet. My friend, I told the story, and my friend was like, I don't believe that show happened. I was like, we can watch it right now. They played this Halloween show in Knights of Columbus in Chicago in it was right before they got like real big. Or no, it was right before like their first album came out and they were a different band. So it had to be like 2003. And there were 2 ways where if you were on the punk scene and the hardcore scene, there were 2 ways in which you knew a band got famous and had like got a record deal. One, they would start destroying their instruments. Because before, these are like shitty punk kids who like, aren't gonna smash their guitars. In that show, we had a sense that they had just gotten a record deal, because for apropos of like nothing, in the middle of their set, Pete just took off his bass and started ramming it into this brick wall. And we were all kind of like, that's new. And so he just didn't have a bass for the rest of the show, which, no offense to him, but maybe it's better for the dynamic of the band, honestly. He's not there to play the bass. And then at the end of the show, this thing happened where, does anyone know the Fall Out Boy song Saturday? They still close their sets with that song, but they used to do it much more aggressively. And so Pete, thinking like, we're in Chicago, we're just still a local band, no one knows the words to our songs, waded out into the crowd to sing the back half of Saturday that I've read about the afterlife I've never really lived. And when it happened, this crazy shit went down where people were so hyped because he was no longer like Pete Wentz from like suburban Chicago. He was like a star now, where they like tore his shirt off and like started grabbing his head and jumping on his back, and the stage collapsed. And like the stage, like literally, like a stage like this fell apart. And to the point where like Patrick like fell on his knees with his guitar, and they had to stop the show and kick us out of Knights of Columbus because, one, it was a fire hazard already, but the stage was like splintering everywhere, and Pete was on the ground like bleeding. And this was at a time when the venues was real small and like you could be up on it. So I remember like looking at the ground And Pete Wentz is like crumbled underneath 3 people and his nose is bleeding. And I was like, they're about to be a very big band. Those are my 2. I won't tell the other one because it's bad, but those are my 2.
Well, thank you so much for
Thank you, Doreen. This was
having
a
me
joy.
talk with you. Hanif.
No, thank
It
you
was
for coming and
fun.
talking to
And
me.
thank you everyone for coming out.
Thanks for listening to me talk. Should I go somewhere to sign a book or 2? Should I stay here? No, right? Oh, thank you. I'll sign books if you want. Or just say hey. If I don't know you, I'd love to say hey. Thank you all.
Thanks again, everyone. And another round of applause for Hanif and Doreen, please.